Good day to all, and welcome on our trip to Tone Town here, and the chairman of the boards. You'll see today that we are a few chairmen short. Both Brian and Grant are out this week, so today it will be just me and you, and we're going to be talking about something that is of specific interest, I think, to not just me, but people who are manufacturing pedals, and I think also to people who are interested in maybe the behind-the-scenes elements of what is required to bring a pedal to market and the cost that it requires in order to make that happen. And I'm sure to some of you, this may be self-evident if you are in a manufacturing business or you own your own business or you have some familiarity with the things that it requires in order to bring a product to market. And what prompted this for me is I frequently see in product releases, not just of my own, but I was noticing this in particular with some other products that were being released, is that you'll see people comment something like, well, I could make that same product for $50. I could build that myself for $50. Or fill in the blank, some number that is a significant undercutting of whatever the cost of the actual product is. And when I see that, I always feel like there's some amount of ignorance in the comment and is not at all, the person making that comment is not at all reflective of the behind the scenes work that is required to even get a pedal there. And so when they say something like this, and I'll be referring to some notes that I have here to kind of keep me on track, is the person even considering what it would cost in terms of the labor? You know, like a lot of times a $200 pedal, even to the manufacturer, the parts cost can almost be half of the amount of their expenses. And that's not including anything that has to do with the development of the product. And what are you charging yourself for assembly? If you're saying you can build this product for $50, how much of that are you considering? Are you paying yourself $10 an hour? Are you paying yourself $20 an hour? We don't know whatever that cost is that they're assuming. And usually I think when people are saying that amount, they're just presuming that they're talking about the parts needed to get it together and source it as one product. But what happens if you want to make it manufacturable? Could you build it for $50 if you were making 100 of them? Could you build it for $50 if you were making 200 of them, 1,000 of them? So it's sort of like the reflection of that comment doesn't consider the scale. And I think beyond that, it doesn't consider the infrastructure to even get it to the point where it's ready to sell. So things like collecting sales taxes, insurance, branding, marketing, and even having a website that would allow you to even sell the product to begin with. So these are all sort of things that maybe are lost on the maybe prospective DIYer that is just throwing a number out like, oh, I could build that for X amount of dollars. It's not considering any of those things. So I think what would be maybe a good place to go into from here is what goes into the cost of a pedal. And I apologize to those of you that are already fully aware of this, but I think it's worth just mentioning as sort of a preamble to maybe getting into some of the other topics of the conversation today. So I think the first is clearly developments, where every pedal starts. There's R&D. There could be coding, depending on whether it's in standard analog overdrive or a DSP-based product, like let's say something you would find from Line 6 or Strymon, things like that. And this can go through many different rounds. You can build up a prototype. In our case, it's typically on a breadboard, and then we're doing some testing and some vetting. Maybe we're bringing in some artists or some players whose ears we trust to kind of get a second opinion, other to our own, to see that, are we on the right track here? Is this worth developing a prototype PCB, which can generally be quite expensive comparatively to, once it goes into manufacturing, you can build the same PCB, let's say 1,000 times or 2,000 times or whatever the volume or the scale is of your particular company. These sort of one-time costs can be pretty high. Every time you prototype, that can be a few $100s, depending on the turnaround time that you want for just the PCB, even for a pedal. And then you still have to assemble it or load it or pay somebody to load it. And typically in a situation where maybe you're using a contract manufacturer, a lot of times they won't do this because the volume is just too small that for them to get involved on a kind of a onesie twosie kind of circuit basis, it doesn't make sense for them to do that. So typically you're either assembling it yourself, and in our case, like all this stuff is surface mount, so it makes it a whole lot harder to be able to do it. And I think most pedal companies are moving that direction as well if they haven't already. But a lot of that is very time consuming. And I think even if you're starting with a product, let's say as a clone or based in something that's already in existence, that timeline to kind of nail it down and get it perfect, it's generally not weeks, but months, at a minimum. And then you also have, any revisions thereof that are going to occur, or maybe bugs that you find in the first one after it's in practice. And generally I like to, at least on our products, and I would presume it's the same for most brands, I like to have it out in the field with a few people to kind of see, like, are there any sort of combinations of things that, when you get it in this context, that it doesn't work anymore, or it has a weird oscillation, or I don't know, if you use it in an effects loop, it has this problem, whatever the issue may be. Having logged some hours and doing a real beta test can be really important to sort of preserve the need for an immediate revision after you come out with your first product. And sometimes we'll see that where almost the V1 is the beta test and the customers are the guinea pigs, and the companies will, pivot after they've released a small number of a first batch because they know that there's going to be inherently some issues. And, that's not a unique thing to the guitar pedal industry, but it is something that definitely happens. I think also, like, other expenses, that's included in the R&D is contracted services. So a lot of companies don't do everything in-house. For example, even if I'm involved in the designing side of a product, there's certain parts of the design that I just know I don't do as efficiently or as effectively as somebody who only does that thing. So, for example, we have people that are amazing at circuit board layouts and are superior to me in their efficiency to be able to do it. And they're able to use, programs like Eagle and things like that really, that people can spend their whole lives just focusing on just that one skill. And so for me, it's not an effective use of my time to be doing that. And a lot of other brands see that the same way. Also, things like graphics, a lot of people don't have an in-house graphics team. So a lot of times they'll contract out that and, get the look of the product the way that they want it. And they'll use somebody who, is an artist, a graphic artist and designer, to create the look of the product that they want. Now, some of the bigger companies do, of course, or there's some that are just, that have already sort of an established look. And so they're maybe just substituting the wording. So like a Boss pedal, for example, probably on their stomp boxes is not requiring a whole graphics team, although I'm sure that they have one, because they're just using the same font and everything like that, and they're deciding on whatever the color aesthetic is. But on the standard stomp box, there's probably not involved on that. But you could see on, I don't know, something that is more sophisticated, that has beautiful graphics and a logo that sort of fits thing. I think of Chase Bliss always has really cool graphics and logos, and they seem to spend a lot of time on the aesthetics of the pedal in addition to everything else that's in there. They may have somebody in-house that's just a gifted artist to do that, but most companies, to get that level of sophistication in the look and in the packaging, because it's not just the pedal, it's like the packaging that it comes in, any sort of stickers or decals that go on outside of it, any sort of the manual that sort of corresponds to whatever it is. Those things all take an incredible amount of time and are difficult to just do organically. If you're just trying to do it yourself as a kind of amateur graphic designer. It's not to say that people haven't done that before, but it's certainly something that is worthwhile to consider as far as development costs. And usually those are the costs that you're trying to, at least in my perspective, you're trying to recoup those in the first, batch of products typically. And this can run, from tens of thousands, and I'm sure for some companies, hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on what it is that the product is attempting to do. Typically in the analog world, I would say it's in the tens of thousands of dollars, and I think it would depend on, the level of sophistication and the amount of things that it does. And, I would say not always, but I think generally, if we know what the target is that we're aiming for, we can typically hit it, I'd say, in 3 to 5 revisions. But each round of revisions is like at least a couple grand by the time like you build the PC board, you have somebody, assemble the PCB, you test it, you do all the things that is required in order to do that. And sometimes also the mechanical side can be really difficult. We often contract that out as well because you have to have this perfect fit. We have pretty established enclosures for our stuff, but sometimes if there's like a slight variation to that and we need the PCB to fit perfectly, a great example of that would be like with our buffer interfaces. We had to have the same PCB fit like side by side in one enclosure and then be able to fit stacked on a different enclosure that would mount to a pedalboard surface. So I think that the thing that you just have to be aware of is the mechanic side of things can be really difficult, especially if you have different styles of enclosures that you're using depending on the product. For us, it was a real challenge to be able to design an enclosure that had two different variations on the same fit, but the same circuit board for both. And so we had to use, ribbon wires and things like that so that it would be two separate PC boards so that they could be arranged in two different orientations. And that sounds like it would be simple, but it's not as easy as it looks, and getting it to fit properly and integrate into like a pedal board surface that we manufacture, and also just have it be available for a standard enclosure for just any player that doesn't have one of our boards. That took quite some time. It took several weeks to get that like totally nailed down and ensure that the fit was right before we started running off enclosures. So things like that can be really time consuming and are all part of the development cost. I think that the next part, of expenses is things like manufacturing. So of course you have the parts, whatever the bill of materials is that you've determined for whatever product it is. That's generally a somewhat predictable cost, but also you have to build in if you're, I think, an astute manufacturing company, you probably have backups for your products, maybe even backups for your backups. So what I mean by this is, let's say that you've established that you prefer the sound of capacitor A the best, but there are going to be occasions where capacitor choice A is not available for certain runs of this product. And so typically you'll have capacitor maybe B and maybe even capacitor C as alternatives that maybe you've already tested in your prototypes that fit the same package size of whatever it is that you have, but you've included those because you need to have alternatives. And this was especially evident during COVID, where there were people that were going to, all the way down the list to Z to find alternative components for things that might work for their particular products, because there just wasn't a lot of availability of certain items that would be standard in most pedals. So I think it's always a good idea to vet multiple substitutes for products so that you have alternatives in your manufacturing and even maybe in your PC board design, that you've given options for different sizes, package sizes to be even exist in there. Potentially, this just makes it a lot easier so that you're able to have several different part substitutions if a certain package size no longer exists. So you'll see that in a lot of different brands. I think are pretty hip to that now. But in the early boutique days, you rarely saw that. But there also wasn't as much scarcity around parts at that particular time. I think in addition to the manufacturing cost of parts, of course, you also have labor, and I think it depends greatly on whether you're manufacturing in the U.S. or you're manufacturing overseas. A pretty common trend that we'll see is a lot of people and brands will manufacture the PCB level things overseas, like either China or Taiwan or Vietnam are kind of the most common places. I think you're also seeing India a little bit, and Sri Lanka also in that conversation. And then they bring the PC boards here, and then they do the assembly, the final assembly here, where maybe they're loading it into the enclosure, they're doing the final QC. And in accordance with the law, you can, I think, still say in that case, I don't think you can say made in USA, but I think you can say assembled in USA. And I'm pretty sure that, like, at least in California, the standard for made in the USA is like almost, I think it's impossible for pretty much any brand, because you have to prove that all of the parts, not just the sourcing of the parts, like you can source a foreign made part from a domestic distributor, but I think you have to prove that all the parts, the means and modes of production are all domestic, are all in the U.S. And I don't think in pedal world there's really anything that you could say that about. I don't know how it is in other states, but I know in California we can't say that. We can say assembled, but we can't say made. And then in some cases it's not made in the U.S. at all. It's made, or Malaysia's another one. It's made in Malaysia. It's made in China. It's made in Taiwan. It's made wherever. But there is definitely a cost to labor, and depending if you're doing it in the U.S., that labor is going to be really different. I've heard some people that I know that say that when they manufacture in China, that they don't even quote labor. It's such an insignificant number as far as the expense of that really they're getting, their primary expense is the parts, and sometimes they're consigning the parts, which means that they're buying the parts and then sending them to the contract manufacturer, which then builds with the parts that they want. And in other cases, they're just doing it all turnkey in China. And then another big shipping expense that's been even more exaggerated through COVID has been getting things back from a manufacturer, a contract manufacturer, because if they're in China, it can be really expensive to get things back now, especially if you're doing it by air. And we learned this with our custom transformer that we make for the Vertex buffer. That's made in China, and that's really the only place we could find that would do the transformer that we wanted, and it's great. And we found a place that does it great. And you can find wonderful stuff made in China. You can also find really terrible stuff made in China. Like a great example is an iPhone. It's a great product. It's used by millions of people. It's 100% made in China. So you can get good stuff there, but you can also get really gnarly stuff there. And that was a nightmare. Like the shipping of the transformer almost cost as much as a run of 1,000 transformers to get it sent by air. And so it can be really expensive to do that. And I think that maybe until recently it was almost more effective to build things in the U.S. because if you were a smaller brand, the volume that you needed to do to make China make sense was just out of reach. If you couldn't afford to make thousands of units and then wait however many months it takes to get here by boat, there just was no reason to do it. You couldn't make up the cost difference because you had to buy so much in order to get that savings. So again, back to manufacturing of your parts costs, your bill of materials, your labor, of course, the shipping, the packaging. These are all things that go into the expense. And I think beyond that, you also have marketing. Once you have this product out there, you have to make videos, you have to take photos, you have to do some sort of advertisements, whether that's digital, whether that's in print. However, I don't recommend the print version. You have social media blasts, the owning of YouTube for a day or for a week where all the influencers are posting about it. These all come at an expense. Most of the social media influencers, they require the product, and I think anywhere between $300 to $1,200 last I checked in order to do a product video. And if you're doing this and owning YouTube, that could be 10 grand easily. There's also legal. A lot of companies now will trademark or try to copyright the name of the product if it's something that's unique to their brand. And usually it's not trying to trademark or create any sort of intellectual property around the circuit. That's pretty rare and unusual and honestly probably wouldn't hold up under any scrutiny, at least in the analog world. But typically they're trying to protect the name so that somebody else doesn't go and make a product that's named a similar thing, so that they have some protection. That seems to be a pretty common thing. And then there's all the sort of overarching sustained costs. You have insurance, you have for the facility, for any sort of liability, workers' comp, you have your lease or rent or mortgage, depending on, whatever capacity you occupy your building, taxes for payroll for your corporation, sales tax that you have to impound if you're, selling directly to customers, utilities. All these things add up to a cost. And again, sort of getting back to what prompted the conversation today is, when somebody says, I can build that for $50, there's almost no consideration of anything that I just mentioned. It's just like, well, if I went to Mauser or I went to DigiKey or I went to wherever this person would presumably buy their parts from, that they think that they could put it all together for $50, and maybe they're factoring in what their labor is worth, maybe they're not. But to build a pedal from scratch, it's not it takes a while, especially if you're not 100% familiar with the circuit. So I would presume that somebody who can build it, let's just say a tube screamer for ease of use, they probably, I would think, if they were going to do it from scratch and not use their own, use a pre-made PCB, it's going to take them a day, or probably pretty close to by the time they drill out their enclosure, they build up the board. I mean, it's not going to take them a full day, but it's going to take them a half day, probably 3-4 hours if they really know what they're doing, to get it fast and get it loaded in and fit perfectly in whatever the enclosure is that they have, and put knobs on it and test it and make sure that it works. It's not, and even if you're just charging labor at that point, let's say charging $50, you're barely paying yourself, under $20 an hour just to do it. And that's considering if you can make it in 3 hours, which, would be a little tricky. So I want to continue with the conversation, but I want to break for a moment to talk about one of our sponsors, which is our friends over at the Guitar Sanctuary. And when Brian is here, ordinarily you're seeing him in the Guitar Sanctuary, where he builds amazing and beautiful pedal boards with wiring looms that look like interstate highways in the greater Los Angeles area, where they're just ducking and coming over in beautiful ways that route all over, from the interface boxes to the switchers to the pedals, and that look absolutely beautiful. And if you want to source some of the products that you might need for your pedal board, those are all available at the Guitar Sanctuary, and then you can give them all to Brian to have him put them together on a beautiful rig for you. Head over to theguitarsanctuary.com and check out their offerings, from boutique pedals to boutique amplifiers to boutique guitars. They have it all at the Guitar Sanctuary. I also want to talk about our friends over at Sweetwater and their program, the Gear Exchange. I have just had a wonderful experience selling off some extraneous gear that I had, and I was able to take all the gear that I sold, and I was able to fund a brand new guitar, a new Fender Custom Shop Stratocaster. And the experience was absolutely great. And the really cool thing about all of the sales that I made on the Gear Exchange is I didn't have to pay any fees, because I decided to take all of my earnings and put them on a Sweetwater gift card. So if you decide to take your earnings on the Gear Exchange and put them on a Sweetwater gift card, you can save that extra 10% or so that you would ordinarily pay in fees. And it just allows you to keep the full amount that you sold your product for, and just helps you get to that product that you want from Sweetwater just a little bit faster. And so I absolutely adore it. It sort of looks similar to how you would find, a listing on Reverb or eBay, but kind of has like a little bit more of an organic feel, like a Craigslist. And I feel like Sweetwater has really made it friendly and easy, and I highly recommend that you set up an account. You do it for free over on sweetwater.com/use, and buy some stuff, sell some stuff, have a good time. So back to pedals. So we kind of talked about what prompted this conversation, some of the expenses that go into it as far as manufacturing and considerations to that end. I want to talk about how prices are typically determined. And this is generalizing, but it is typically true of most brands as far as how they determine what the street price is going to be. The price that you're going to see listed when you go to Sweetwater, you go to the Guitar Sanctuary, you go to Chicago Music Exchange, or any of these places, and you see the price of a pedal. So the typical way that we see, or that we determine prices, is usually 4x the cost. So a typical price for a boutique product is $200. So that means that product is typically made for $50. So $50 times 4, $200. And some people might be hearing that right now and say, well, that's ridiculous. The guy was right who said I can make that for $50. And you can make it for $50 if you're making a couple thousand. And this number may be slightly different for smaller companies, but I'm sort of speaking about companies that were probably around my size or bigger. And I'm not considering myself in the same category as anybody like a JHS. They're certainly bigger than us, or a Boss are certainly way bigger than us. But I think when you're talking about volume of, let's say manufacturing runs in the thousands for a first run, this is typically what you're looking at. It's $50 is the cost, and then it's going to be 4x for the consumer price. Now, that does sound like a lot, but again, we've talked about all the other things that go into the expenses before this, as far as R&D, all these different things. And there isn't a $150 differential in what actually is available to you as the maker of the pedal, because you hear it's $50 cost, you sell it for $200, there's $150 in profit in there. That's not what it looks like. So to give you a sense of how this breaks down, so most people are selling through dealers and distributors. It's a pretty common way that you'll see pedal companies of a certain size operate. So typically you see with dealers and distributors, they're getting between 30 to 50% off of whatever the street price is that you see. So if you're seeing a pedal that's $200, the dealers and distributors are typically paying between $100 and $140 a pedal. So this means that as the manufacturer, you're probably earning somewhere around $50 to $90 per pedal. And again, this $50 that of the costs, these are things that, we're not even really considering the marketing expenses or any of the sustained costs of, keeping the lights on in whatever facility that you're in, and the payroll taxes and all this stuff. These are just kind of like the cost considerations of the parts and materials, maybe some of the development costs built in, and the labor built in. So you're not getting the full amount of whatever the differential is there. And most of your sales are going to come from those distributors that are getting closer, to buying the pedal for $100, which means you're only profiting really $50 a product at the end of the day, if that. And that's, again, not considering all the other add-ons that we talked about before, because the distributors are typically buying the most volume. And that's why they're getting these really discounted prices, because they're buying, several hundred units of your new release all at the same time. And then they're distributing them out to smaller stores that exist in wherever their country of origin is, whether that's the US, whether that's the UK, whether that's Japan, wherever it may be. They're going to make up the bulk of your sales. So most of your products are going to be selling at that lower price point to the dealers, which means that your earnings are actually much smaller, but you're selling a lot more product. The mom and pop stores that maybe just buy a few here and there, those are the ones where maybe you're getting a $90 profit, but you're not selling a lot of those to mom and pop stores. You're typically selling most of them to your bigger box dealers that are going to push out a lot of different products. Now, if you're selling direct, of course, you'll make a little bit more money, but typically companies don't sell direct that are of a certain size, because the amount of customer touch time, the amount of sort of like warehousing ability that you need to have, the amount of shipping logistics that you need to have in place, it's exaggerated considerably by having that dealer kind of interrupting that path and at least being like kind of the first point of contact for customers should there be a problem or should there be a shipping issue that never makes its way all the way back to the manufacturer. Selling direct puts all of that on you. And so a lot of companies can't afford or don't have the infrastructure to afford to be able to support that. And so the dealers are the natural choice. I can see if you're like really small, then you would do that because you can sort of have enough control over your inventory to be able to kind of ship things kind of onesie twosie sort of thing. But when you reach a certain size, you really just can't do that anymore. It becomes really, really difficult. I mean, I saw that Chase Bliss decided to do that. And, I think that it's great. I think that they have a great built-in audience. I'm sure that it was a difficult learning curve to kind of figure out how to appropriately staff for the needs of a shipping department that's shipping direct, especially on a product release. It can be really, really all hands on deck to do that. And we've tried that at different points of the development of Vertex, and it was just an insane amount of work to attempt to do that. And early days, it was fine. But as you start to grow, it can be really difficult to sustain that. So just something that is something to name. Another thing that I was thinking about in terms of cost that maybe, or costs are just considerations for things that go on as far as where we see prices, the cost to develop a product. Another thing I thought about, sort of a caveat to that, is artist signature pedals, or just artist signature stuff in general. So to kind of give you a sense of where those things typically lie, those are typically 6 to 8% of gross sales. And I think that's pretty uniform between huge companies like Fender who have artist signature products to smaller pedal companies that might have artist signature products. It's typically what you see. It's typically around 6 to 8%. And, I've been asked about this from other pedal manufacturers about what my thoughts are on doing things like artist signature products, and I think that they can be a blessing and they can be a curse, and I'll explain why they can be tough. So I think that the first thing is that it can be very difficult to keep an artist happy long term, even if you have a contract that spells out explicitly whatever the royalty is. There's always going to be this initial surge of sales when a new product comes out. So when artist X endorses this product, they're doing videos with you, they're collaborating with you, and you have a new product, and everybody's who's a fan of theirs is going to buy it, and everybody who is a dealer of yours is always going to buy into an initial launch. So you're guaranteed to have a pretty good performance out of the gate. But then you start to see what the sustained performance might look like. And a lot of times, if it's not like a huge artist that is just, ubiquitous, like a Slash or something like that, once you've saturated sort of the fans of whoever that artist are, you're going to start to see a pretty sharp taper of the sustained sales. And I think that the artists sometimes can have a difficult time understanding that the paychecks that they were getting for royalties for the first quarter of the release may not be mirrored in the second or third. And you'll start to maybe get a more realistic view of what the sustained sales look like after maybe 2 quarters of being out, because, again, you've given their fans time to purchase the product. And after that, you're kind of seeing who's willing to buy this product or what the staying power is of this product, even if it's a great product, as it after it sort of goes through its initial peaking. And then it kind of gives you a better example of what you should expect to see sort of long term. And sometimes the expectation of the artist can be really difficult to manage if they saw that, Q1 or Q2 were 3 or 4 times higher than what they got on Q4 and Q3 and Q4. And that can be a difficult thing, and sometimes having to placate emotions and explain some of this to an artist can be really, really difficult. And sometimes it can affect their pride, their ego, and it can be difficult to keep them happy. And I think a lot of companies that I've talked to have sort of bent over backwards to try to replicate the income of earlier time in their release schedule to try to make them feel good. And ultimately, this ends up just being a losing proposition. And you can see a lot of artists can bounce around from different companies, especially as it relates to signatures, or can have multiple signature products over time from different brands, or basically the same product from different brands as a signature product. And this isn't just related to pedals. This can be related to guitars, because it's really attractive for a brand to be able to have the name, image, and likeness of an artist behind them. But the long-term prospect can be really, really hard unless the artist is super realistic up front about what things might look like, and are not just there for the purposes of manipulating the brand. And that's not to say all artists are like that. And there's some that you can see have had these really long partnerships with brands that they've been with their whole careers. But there's others that you see that just bounce around and, you're like, well, what guitar is artist X using? And the answer is somebody new. It's just like a different person all the time, or a different brand all the time. So, this is just something to kind of be aware of behind the scenes. And as far as like profitability, I would say for a lot of artist products, I think for a lot of brands, it ends up being a loss leader. And by that, I mean that the brands are willing to take a little bit of a bath on the profits, or at least maybe break even, but they are gaining access to the audience that artist brings. And as a consequence of that, they're able to bring in more people to check out their products, whether that be pedals, whether that be guitars, whether that be amps. And knowing that if that particular fan of that artist, knows that the artist uses brand X, they're more likely to buy other products from brand X, and having that association is sort of treated more like a marketing expense. I want to continue along these lines, but I would like to go through a few more sponsors that make the podcast possible every single week. The first of which are our friends over at Mono, and that's monocreators.com. Now, I use their double gig bag all the time if I want to take two guitars, often taking a Strat and a Les Paul. They have some of the best gig bags out there. I have honestly never seen anything that really rivals what it is that they do. Also, as far as pedal boards are concerned, I know that Grant is a huge fan of the Mono pedal boards. I've never tried one, but they look absolutely amazing. I saw that they also released a really cool new compact switch mode power supply, which might be something that I'll have to check out. Mono Creators is doing our listeners a huge solid by offering them 10% off anything in their store at monocreators.com. by using the coupon code Chairmen, CHAIRMEN. Head over to monocreators.com, check out what they're offering, use the coupon code, and get 10% off. Also, I want to talk about Bestronix. And we always talk about the great Brad Bartosh from Bestronix, just a salt-of-the-earth Midwesterner outside of Chicago, Illinois, in Tinley Park. Absolute great family-run establishment, and they have everything that you need for pedal boards. They have dual lock, they have zip ties, they have tie mounts, they have cable, they have plugs, they have the 2.1 millimeter connectors that you would use to connect all of your power cables to your actual pedals if you're trying to customize them in a DIY fashion. They have RCA if you're going to go with the chalk supply, you want to customize those. They have everything that you need. And an absolutely great establishment. Amazing customer service. Head over to btpa.com. Again, btpa.com. Use the code DACHAIRS, DACHAIRS. Get 10% off your entire order. Anything that you want for your pedalboard needs is going to be there. You can always email Brad if you have any questions about what you might need, any sort of specs, sizing, etc., and he can help you. Again, Bestronix, amazing company. We buy stuff from them all the time. Lastly, I want to talk about our friends over at Stringjoy. Stringjoy is at stringjoy.com, and they are offering our listeners 10% off any strings on their website. And not only do they have all the strings that you could ever want, from coated to nickel, etc., you can also sign up for a subscription service so that you can have strings delivered to your home every single month, depending on whatever cadence of string replenishment that you need. They offer that service, so it's absolutely amazing. If you want to just have a fresh set of strings for all your guitars every single month, you can order that from stringjoy.com. I'm using them on all my guitars, and I have had amazing luck with them. I finally tried out their coated strings, which I'm really impressed with. Absolutely love them. Check out stringjoy.com. Use the coupon code BOARDS, BOARDS, and get 10% off. All right, so we just talked about artist signature pedals. We talked a little bit about the cost to distributors and dealers. I want to talk about something that's also kind of interrelated to this, about what happens when you release a pedal and it's a flop, doesn't work out. And every company's had this happen. We've had this happen. What do you do? Well, typically what we see when this happens is you'll see things like blowout sales. And usually the intent there is to just recoup any expenses that you can. I think for most brands, any new release, you're always going to see a good ramp up in sales. You're always going to see, if you have an established dealership network, you're always going to see that you can make some pretty good sales out of the gate. I mean, unless like it's just an automatic turn off, or I've never seen that, but so I can't foresee a lot of situations where that would happen. But generally, all of your dealers want to take your product seriously. They want to buy in at a certain minimum that they feel comfortable with, and they're going to do their best to sell the product. But usually after the first initial launch, you'll get to see, did the product connect? Did the audience that you thought would want this product actually want this product? And are you able to produce sustained sales? Some companies will basically look at whatever the performance is the first, let's say, 8 to 12 weeks, and then make a determination. Are we going to manufacture more, get more in the pipeline, or are we going to cut our losses and take everything that we have on hand that's remaining and either do a stupid deal of the day blowout through Musician's Friend, which is something that you can see happen from time to time with certain brands, or you see some sort of direct sale blowout, or you see some sort of like B stock blowout, which is not really a B stock blowout. And this can kind of be a workaround to not affect the products that are already with the dealer, but try to work around it, and to say that, these are not as new or have some sort of cosmetic damage, which are essentially the same exact product, it just called B stock for whatever reason, to sort of be able to get it sold without competing directly with its new counterparts. You'll see things like this typically as ways to sell things that are, they're trying to be liquidated, but again, not affect or upset your dealers. In the intent here is really just to test out different methodologies or different circuits that you think might work in the consumer space. And that you're going to have to kind of cycle through some stuff. You're swinging at the piñata and you're hoping that you get a hit. And if you don't, you're prepared to basically liquidate after a short period of time. And there's some companies that are sort of built around this particular style of sales, where big ramp up, own YouTube for a week, lots of videos, lots of content. They're trying to see if it does well. If it doesn't do well in that, period of time, then they're immediately ready to like cut ties with it, blow it out, get it gone, recoup as much as they can, and then just use that to seed the next product, because the business, the style of the business model is just predicated on having to continue to keep the wheels turning, just more products, new products, new products, new products. Typically that's, when you're seeing companies that are releasing products every couple months, that can often be, but not necessarily, their business model is to just release a lot of products quickly. And if they don't connect, then they cut ties with it and they move on to the next thing. And that's sort of the way that they produce. There's also people that are on the opposite end of that, like one that I really admire that I've talked about before is Exotic. They don't really come out with flops. They've had very few, if any, during their time. And they really focus on depth instead of breadth. And you may see that they might come out with one pedal a year. And then a lot of the pedals that they released even 15 years ago or more, 20 years ago, are still relevant today. And when I think about pedal companies that I would really want to emulate the business side of what they do, there's certainly one that comes to mind, because they've had a lot of longevity. They make great quality stuff, and they're not in the game of just releasing stuff because. They're releasing stuff that is premeditated, and that they want to release something that when it comes out that it's right. And I have a lot of respect for that. And that's not to say that not great pedals can come out from people that are doing these regular releases. I just think that they're banking on, sort of casting a wide net, and they know that maybe 1 in 3, 1 in 4 is going to stick. And then that's going to become another mainstay on their product line. But then you see their number of discontinued products, and it's a fairly long list. And I'm not saying that one style is right over the other. Just the one that I try to emulate is something that's more aligned with Exotic, because I just think that I like the idea that we have pedals that have been around for, in our case, not as long as Exotic, but let's say 12 years. Things like our Vertex Boost are still on boards to this day and still used by a lot of people, whether it's the V1 or the V2. Like, to us, that's a legacy product that we'll always be able to sell that. Steel String, another product we'll always be able to sell. It's on a lot of boards, and it's been out there for probably 8 years now, in various incarnations. Ultraphonics too sells a lot for us. Still sells a ton, and I think our buffers are gonna be in that category. We've sold an extraordinary amount of buffers for a pedal that's not that cool. It's like doing the foundation of your house. It's like it costs a good amount of money, and you don't get to see any of the beauty of what's underneath the house. It's not like doing a new kitchen where you get to be in it every day, or a new bathroom. You get to be in and get to see the beauty of all your money that you spent. Buffer's that thing that's like underneath your pedal board or kind of hidden away, and It's not sexy, but you really want to make sure you have a good one to ensure the integrity of everything else that's going on the pedal board. And so I'm always happy when I see that we're selling a good number of those, because it's such an important product to have a good version of, and there just aren't enough good ones out there. I wish there were more. I wish there were more that we could refer people to who either can't afford ours or don't need the level of sophistication of ours. There's just not enough of them out there. Let's see. Here's another thing I wanted to talk about cheap pedals. So another thing that I'll see often, again, kind of talking about the expenses of pedals or the cost of pedals, is the need for clones, and why people sometimes will often go to a clone, or will say that a clone is just as good, that's made by an overseas company, or made by a company that just sells super cheap on Amazon. When we're thinking about replica pedals, and we're thinking about pedal quality, we talked earlier about let's say a pedal that's $200 at market, right? So standard kind of boutique American company, let's say. And not just exclusive to American companies, but typically we're talking about American companies when we're thinking about boutique pedal brands. And, of course, there's some in Europe, there's some all around the world, but I think let's take a JHS, for example. Like most of the pedals are around $199, $99, something like that. And so if it costs, let's say, roughly $50 to make a $200 pedal, if you're buying a $50 pedal and it has to cost, 4x that, you're looking at, not very much money at this point. If you're talking about, some of these Amazon pedals are less than $40, like $39.99, so it's somewhere it has to cost like $10 or less to make. And so the question to me is like, how the heck do they do it? Like for under $10, or if it's a $50 pedal, let's say $12.50 or something like that. How are they making this? Because the parts alone for knobs, jacks, like if you're using even just mid-level quality, you're at least going to be that for just 3 pots, the jacks, the circuit board, the parts, all this stuff. So they have to be just buying firstly in either insane quantities, or they're using absolutely garbage parts. And that there's just no way that they could get an alpha foot switch or a Neutrik jack, or any of the stuff that would, or like we always said alpha pots, an alpha foot switch, an alpha pot, or a Neutrik jack. They're just not going to be able to use that, because that blows their budget already just right there. And I think that the consideration of a lot of places in China not even really quoting for labor, I think that they have to be basically charging or not paying anybody a wage in order to even build these things, because of the cost of them has to be under $10 to reach a $40 price point, or under $12.50 to reach a $50 price point. How are they even doing it? Like the parts have to be like the lowest quality possible. They can be made super cheaply or bought super cheaply. And even if it has the sound that you want, that can replicate a King of Tone or can replicate a Klon, I mean, those parts have got to be on borrowed time, because there's just no way that you can make something of high quality that is, done on a proper wave soldering machine that's QC'd properly. I'm 100% sure they're not QCing these. There's just no time. There's no time for that amount of money. I just don't think that you're ever going to get something of the same quality of a JHS pedal or an Analog Man pedal or fill in the blank replica that's $50 as opposed to $200, or $20 as opposed to $150, or whatever the conversion may be. I think you can probably get a good sounding pedal, and I think that without a doubt there's some guys that have done some comparisons of, say, an original King of Tone versus the one that looks just like it, that is made by, I forget what the name of the pedal is, like it's some number like 69 pedals or something like that. That they sounded really close, and I'm sure that you're 100% sure you can probably get close to sound, if not identical to the sound. It's like, how long is this thing going to last? And maybe the justification is, well, I could buy 10 of these for the price of one Analog Man King of Tone, and so to me, it's worth it. But, I think it's ultimately, if you want to satisfy the itch for a King of Tone or a Klon or whatever it is that you want that's more expensive, I don't think anything's going to really scratch that itch unless it's the real thing. But I think when I see companies that are making replicas for that cheap, I mean, it's going to be the worst possible components you can find that are going to get you that sound. And maybe that's fine for you. Again, maybe you're like, hey, I could buy 4 of these for the price of one of the original. So what do I care if, the jack goes bad or the foot switch goes bad or whatever. But I don't know, I guess the insurance policy for like gigging musicians to like know that if you step on something that's going to work 10 out of 10 times is like worth the incremental cost difference, or the idea that you're supporting, the originating brand, if you can even call it that. I know that with, analog circuits, there's really no propriety to that. Like there's no intellectual property that brands can really claim, because all this stuff has predated all of us. And, as I've said many times, comes from, national semiconductor application notes. There's just nothing that hasn't already been done before. And so, you make an easy argument to say that it's all fair game. So in any case, this was a monologue, a long one, on some of the costs behind what it takes to create pedals, what some of the hidden expenses are that you may not have considered, what the dealership sort of structure looks like, and then how that affects the overall cost. Obviously, when you see it for $200, that's not what we're making. We have to sell it for less, and we have to include our expenses. And typically, these expenses don't include sustained expenses, as we mentioned before, insurance, utilities, payroll taxes, all these different things that are just something that the business has to pay, over and over again, irrespective of whatever product it is that they're manufacturing. And, a lot of one-time costs as you develop. And we talked about a little bit of artist signatures, how that works if you have a product like that, how that it factors into the expense. I should also say on that sometimes companies will try to create an offset. Like if normally their products are $200, maybe they'll charge $220 to try to build in some offset, knowing that they're going to be paying a certain percentage to the artist. And so that can kind of help pad some of the expenses, which is not an uncommon thing. We talked about flops. When something doesn't sell, what do the companies do? How do we get rid of it? And again, this isn't just other companies. Like most people have had to do some version of this at some point. If they've been selling pedals and making pedals for more than 10 years, they've probably had to do some version of almost every point that we've talked about on in this conversation. And then we talked a little bit about cheap pedals, clones and replicas that are emulating popular pedals in the marketplace. Are they good value? Sure. Are they going to last? I think the answer is no. I think the bigger question is does it matter to you? If you can buy 4 of them for the price of a brand new version of whatever the thing is that it replicates, are you okay with, sort of the disposable nature of cheap pedals, and they're also pretty unserviceable in most cases. It wouldn't even be worth it to take it to somebody to try to fix it, because there's not enough value in what it is that the product is. So anyway, all interesting questions. I would, of course, love to hear from you in the comment section if you think there's some other considerations here that should be talked about perhaps in a future episode, or if there's things that you think I oversimplified or misrepresented. I'm curious what you think. Again, this was unedited, off the top of my head. Of course, I had some notes, kind of guidelines for kind of some things I thought were worth mentioning. But I hope, if anything, that the conversation was eye-opening to you as far as what goes on behind the scenes. I don't think all this stuff is secret. I think that there's been versions of each one of these points that have been brought up before by manufacturers themselves, I think especially in the boutique world. So I don't think that this is any secret or anything that you couldn't find out on your own. But I do think it's maybe worth consolidating into one place and kind of talking about these various aspects. Ultimately, there's always going to be the guy that's going to say, I can make that for $50, and maybe he can. But I think that there, of course, is a lack of consideration of all the other things that are going on behind the scenes. And then, like, how do you actually bring this pedal you can purport to make for $50 to market? Because that means that in order to make it for that much, you're having to make it for $12.50 in actuality to really make it profitable and have a business around it, which I think most of these guys couldn't do. In fact, I would argue to say none of them can do it. It's just an impossibility based on, what things cost, and presumably they're going to be costing more. I think inflation is starting to take effect. I think in some pedal brands you're already starting to see prices creep up, and it's not because they're trying to gouge you. They're honestly paying a whole lot more for the same thing that cost a whole lot less a year ago. So I think that's to be expected, and I think wherever there can be some context around pricing, I think it's good to have some transparency around. I hope that that's what this offered. And again, I would appreciate any commentary that you might have as it relates to the conversation. And until next time, we will see you a little further down the road to Tone Town, and next week with Brian and Grant all hopping into the Miata and talking tone, talking gear, and getting to converse with you all. See you.